So far, we've been focusing our attention on race, which in our society is all about biology, due to the emphasis we place on hypodescent, or the one-drop rule. What's missing from this is a consideration of culture, and this is where the term ethnicity enters the picture. Believe it or not, the use of the word ethnic is a very recent development. The word didn't even appear in the dictionary until the 1960s. The introduction of this term has further changed the way we think of race, and even culture. Ultimately, it's important to remember that within any given racial group or category, there are going to be many different cultures, many different ethnicities. This is yet another reason why the system of racial categories is problematic. These categories fail to acknowledge the rich cultural diversity of the many peoples who have been sorted into the same racial box. This means that, as social scientists, we need to focus on ethnicity in order to take this cultural dimension into account. A helpful way to think about ethnic groups is to look at their characteristics. As we go through them, and in line with social constructionism, keep in mind that all of these characteristics may vary in terms of how strong they are, depending on time and place. So you can think of each of these traits as existing on a continuum from weak to strong. Again, the strength of these characteristics is going to vary according to the social and historical context. Now we're ready to look at these characteristics. First of all, ethnic groups will display unique cultural traits. In other words, they maintain a set of values, beliefs, traditions, and behaviors that distinguish them from other ethnic groups, as well as from society as a whole. These cultural traits are especially noticeable when it comes to language, accent, religion, clothing, and so on. For example, Hasidic Jews have a distinct culture that is different from the dominant Christian culture of the United States. The most obvious difference has to do with religion, as well as values and belief systems, but there are also differences in language, dress, and the observation of holidays. But at the same time, distinct cultural traits aren't enough to define an ethnic group. Sociologists, for example, have a distinct language of concepts and theories and so forth, but we're not an ethnic group, so there has to be something more. For a group to be an ethnic group, there should also be a sense of community. There is a we feeling among members of the group that stems from a sense of having a shared ancestry or heritage. In fact, the unique cultural traits don't even have to be pronounced to have this we feeling. An Irish person doesn't even really have to exhibit Irish traits to consider themselves Irish. As long as we believe we are ethnic in this way, we will identify as Irish. In Boston, for example, there are a lot of Irish people, but they actually have very little left in common with those from Ireland, other than the outward signs, such as Claddagh rings and St. Patrick's Day. In fact, I knew one person who was from Ireland who was embarrassed by the Irish in the United States. She felt that they tried too hard to be Irish. In some ways, such as in their attitudes surrounding the rings and St. Patrick's Day, she felt that they were more Irish than the Irish themselves. This is because the Ireland that people in the United States identify with was the Ireland their ancestors left behind when they immigrated to the United States 100 years ago. But in the meantime, Ireland itself has continued to change and is now very different from the Ireland of the past. They don't eat corned beef and cabbage there anymore, like the Irish do here when they want to show how Irish they are. That's ancient history. I was told that on St. Patrick's Day, many people in Ireland sit and watch the St. Patrick's Day parades in New York and Boston on TV. And they don't think to themselves, let's show our solidarity with the Irish in the United States. Instead, they're thinking, let's watch those ridiculous Americans pretend to be Irish. So American Irish people have a sense of community that even people from Ireland do not. In Ireland, everybody is Irish, so it's not really distinctive. But those living in this country define themselves as Irish, and so we in this country consider them to be Irish. People from Ireland don't think of them as Irish, they see them as more American than anything else. People from Ireland actually focus more on whether they are Protestant or Catholic. Those are their ethnic identities. That's where they get their sense of community. And we've seen the violent results of that ethnic difference, which brings up the next characteristic of ethnic groups. The we feeling we just discussed often leads to ethnocentrism. Remember that this means that we tend to judge other groups by the standards and values of our own group. The result is that we end up thinking our group is superior to their group. We think of ourselves as better than they are. Now, it's important to realize that there is a benefit of ethnocentrism. This type of thinking creates and strengthens group solidarity. It gives us a sense of group pride. The more at odds we are with others, the more cohesive our own group becomes. This is especially apparent in militant groups such as white supremacists. These groups are very cohesive. In other parts of the world, such as the former Yugoslavia, where you had Serbs, the Croats, the Muslims, and so forth, this group solidarity took the extreme form of nationalism and ethnic cleansing. We also see it between the Palestinians and the Israelis, not to mention here in the United States. So, the serious downside of ethnocentrism and the increase in group solidarity is that it also provides the basis of oppression and conflict between groups. So, ethnocentrism and solidarity have both positive and negative aspects. Another characteristic of ethnic groups is that membership is ascribed. In other words, we don't choose an ethnic group. We are born into an ethnic group. There are even times and places where you may have had your ethnic identity forced upon you, even if you don't identify with that group. It's ascribed no matter what. This happened to people of Jewish descent in pre-World War II Germany. Anyone with any Jewish heritage was considered to be Jewish, even if they themselves identified as German and they were Christian. And we know what the result of that was. But notice how similar this is with the one-drop rule in our society. Race was determined by birth and appearance didn't matter. A person with any non-white lineage was excluded from that category and forced to accept a non-white identity. We aren't all that different from Nazi Germany, particularly in our past. But again, remember that these characteristics exist on a continuum from weak to strong, which means that this ascribed membership can actually vary. In some countries, such as our own, we don't really have to recognize our ethnicity because ethnic boundaries are not very rigid. People intermarry and have children all the time, so many people will find that they have a variety of ethnicities in their background and can pick and choose which one they want. That's not so easy in Bosnia or Palestine or Israel, for example. People there aren't as free to choose one part of their heritage over another, to choose to be Serbian like your grandmother or Croat like your father. At the same time, in our society, some people can pass as being part of an ethnic group without being born into it at all. For example, anyone can wear green and celebrate St. Patrick's Day, or put on a "Kiss Me I'm Polish" button, although you're much more likely to pass as Irish or Polish if you're white. So ethnic boundaries are comparatively fluid in our country, at least right now. This also introduces an interesting aspect of white privilege within our culture, which is captured with the concept of optional ethnicities. In other words, in a white-dominated world, white people can choose to be just white, or they can choose to identify with their ethnic origins, Irish, Norwegian, German, Italian, and so on. In other words, And ethnic identity is something that white people have the privilege of putting on or taking off at will. Race, on the other hand, is not at all optional. It's imposed on people regardless of their wishes. Finally, ethnic groups may exhibit a certain amount of territoriality, meaning they tend to occupy a shared space. However, this too varies from one society to another and from one time to another. So in the past, in the United States, there were distinct communities that were Irish, Italian, German, Polish, Norwegian, and so on. And you'll still see this today as new immigrant groups settle within the same neighborhood, creating what are called ethnic enclaves. Places where they can keep the culture of their homeland alive while they adjust to living in a new country. Oftentimes, the distinctive culture within these ethnic enclaves begins to fade over generations as their children and grandchildren assimilate to the dominant culture. By the fourth generation, their descendants have lost much of their cultural distinctiveness and heritage. But there are still pockets of ethnic groups sharing a territory. We've all heard of Chinatown, for example. In Boston, the North End is dominated by Italians, and Brookline is largely Jewish, and South Boston is largely Irish. But in the past, there were very distinct boundaries between ethnic groups, and people knew where they were and where they could and could not go. In fact, this became formalized in a system called redlining, which we'll go over during class. Okay, let's wrap this up. Even though we have this list of characteristics of ethnic groups, it's important to remember that there are variations in all of them. Ethnic groups will have all of these characteristics, but not necessarily to the same degree because each one exists on a continuum from weak to strong. How strong they are will vary depending on the social and historical context. What makes this whole topic even more messy is that before the 1960s, when the idea of ethnicity developed, we used to call different ethnic groups races. So again, there was the Irish race, and they were considered to be animals and subhuman. They too faced discrimination, as represented by the Irish Need Not Apply signs, which appeared with job notices earlier in our history. Another difficulty in distinguishing between race and ethnicity is that we still use the term race in an encompassing way that ignores the distinct cultural differences within a particular race. So when we say Asian, for example, we are ignoring the fact that Hmong, Vietnamese, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Cambodians, those from India, people who are adopted by Americans, and so forth, are very different from one another. Even saying Latinx hides the fact that there are Black people, white people, indigenous, Mexicans, Argentinians, and people from Belize who speak English, and people from Brazil who speak Portuguese, who all share the same racial label, despite the fact that their cultures are so different. Their ethnicity is different. Because the term race hides ethnic differences, some social scientists have scrapped the term race altogether and now only speak of ethnic groups or racial ethnic groups. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts on the matter when we see each other in class.